Hello, welcome to Meet the Author. We're part of the Author Event Network, which is a community of authors here in the Seattle, Kitsap, and Portland area who collaborate to go sell signed editions of our books at all major events and festivals. Look us up. We have a number of places where you'll get to see us this year. Tonight, we're meeting with a new author, Rick Fordyce, who's an author of multiple books. And welcome, Rick. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
That's a pleasure. Well, Rick, first off, tell us about what inspires you to start writing books.
Well, in college, it's basically when I started reading more and more literature, and my writing is literary fiction, and I just wanted to, having grown up here in Seattle, to write about the Pacific Northwest. Also, my father was at the University of Washington, and he was actually at UW-Medicine, and he wrote like a health book for nursing and things like that. So to see this book sitting there in the family living room, I thought, well, that sounds like a good idea too.
So you had sort of some family influence in that, and of course you had to kind of live up to Dad.
Right. Yeah.
Well, tell us. You mentioned growing up in Seattle. Tell us a little bit more about your roots in the Northwest.
All right. Well, I grew up in North Seattle, and I'm a third-generation Washingtonian. Both of my parents grew up in Washington State. My father in Sunnyside, and my mother in Blanchard, which is up around Bellingham. And I have to tell you, right now, my mother is living on First Hill in assisted living, and in January she turned 101.
Wow.
So, like Sunday I go over, and it's like going to visit your mom on Sunday. So that kind of created this Seattle and Washington bond that I feel like more than anything else I'm a child of Seattle.
Excellent. Well, I'm sure you're used to the weather and the seasons and everything else. I'm from California, so I'm still getting used to it. Tell us about what are the main themes that your readers would find in your books?
Well, I guess this book here is kind of it's sort of my legendary book.
And the title is?
All right, the title is I Climbed Mount Rainier with Jimi Hendrix's High School Counselor and Other Stories of the Pacific Northwest.
So you got to meet Jimi Hendrix's counselor. Was that an inspirational experience for you?
Well, I had collected over the years these stories of Seattle and the Pacific Northwest, fictionalized stories of basically growing up here. And having had this experience of climbing Mount Rainier with Jimi Hendrix's high school counselor, I took that and made it into a story and made it as the title of the book. So it's just one of maybe 15 stories in there about Seattle and the Pacific Northwest.
So other than your climbing Mount Rainier story, what are the themes of Glenn and your other book? It doesn't look like it, they both look like they're based in Africa as opposed to the Northwest. Tell us about those experiences.
All right, so in my mid-20s, I joined the Peace Corps, and I was sent to Ghana and West Africa. In fact, this is all kind of connected to my whole writing history. In the mid-70s, there were just writing schools were just kind of beginning. The UW had started its creative writing program, and I remember applying for it, but I had spent so many years in college as it was that I was, I want to go out there and start writing. And so I had always thought that what a writer did was they moved to Paris for 6 months and lived there, and that's how they wrote. So I decided to join the Peace Corps, and I took a portable Smith Corona typewriter with me and sat in a little village where I was teaching high school math and English for a few hours a day, and then the rest of the day was basically free, and I did a lot of writing there, and it also created this real kind of backbone with writing where for 2 years I'm in this little village there in West Africa, and there's no electricity, no running water. Of course, there's no TV, no internet. So what you did was you read. You read books, and then you wrote. You kept a daily journal. You had to write letters back to Seattle, and you wrote letters to the other Peace Corps volunteers. And then I had my typewriter and I would write stories. So it was just kind of this environment of constantly writing, and I kind of want to emphasize how helpful that was, as opposed to going to a Master of Fine Arts program and trying to learn how to write there. And so it was, for 2 years, it was just this constant writing that I really felt kind of boosted my start in trying to write.
Now, are these nonfiction books or are these fictional books? And if so, what are the themes?
So these are fiction. The first one is a novel. It's called Glenn, and it's about a Vietnam veteran who actually ends up in the Peace Corps in West Africa. And I was not in Vietnam, but the story is more that when I went over there to Ghana in 1978, so Vietnam had just ended in 1975, and there were a few hundred Peace Corps volunteers in Ghana at that time, and I was surprised that 2 of them were Vietnam veterans. And as I talked with them, they basically said that, yeah, they felt so bad about what had gone on in Vietnam that they had joined the Peace Corps. They were going to try to kind of like counteract that by trying to do something positive. So soon after I was there, I heard about one of these veterans who was in another village not that far from me, and he had been there 2 years already, and he was going for a 3rd year, and his life ended up ending there. And so basically I felt like this story was kind of handed to me, and so I kind of based the whole novel on that. And a lot of it is my time there with the Peace Corps in Ghana.
So it's based on true experiences, but you fictionalized it.
Right, yeah.
Okay. Is there, what do you think that you want your reader to pull out of this when they're done? Is this an uplifting story? Is it a thoughtful story? Tell us about the spiritual experience of reading this.
I guess that there is, people, it's almost like, war is not the answer. These people who were sent to war, and here's this thing, the Peace Corps, which is the exact opposite of it. Kennedy started this thing, you send people, basically you're sending people out there with books and stuff like that. And you got to interact with the people of these countries, on a level that you never ever would, even as a soldier. So, I don't know, that's kind of the big takeaway from that one.
Well, tell us about White Africa Plain.
All right, so while there, I wrote a number of stories just on experiences there, and in fact, the first story in here is called Away, and that's the one story that was published by a literary magazine, actually here in Seattle, and then it was nominated for a Pushcart Prize, which some people know what a Pushcart Prize is, but and then other stories, just as a fiction writer, you just start coming up with stories after story, and they were written over many, many years, and finally I get enough of them and I put them together in a book like that.
So it's an anthology. Do the stories have a consistent thread that pulls through them, or are they each individual experiences with a wide range of themes?
I would say that each one is very different from every other one, and they're told through the perspective of me or of a foreigner there in Africa, and they're also from the perspective of people living there.
Mm-hmm. So tell us about your writing process. How do you go about developing what you want to write about, and how you capture these stories? And
well, I know there's from the time I started writing, like in my 20s, you hear this term writer's block. For me it was always writer's flood. Mm-hmm. There was too much to write about. I just would have so many things going. I mean, we're talking about back with manual typewriters, and I would do the whole write out stories, and then you could send them to places, like the Atlantic or the New Yorker, and back then you'd actually get a reply from them. Usually it was just the generic, sorry, this doesn't fit our needs at this point, but every now and then somebody would actually handwrite something on there, and I mean, I'm kind of going on about how that has changed, and then eventually that all vanished. So I just supported myself by doing construction. In fact, like exterior home improvements. I ended up moving to Cape Cod and did a lot of working and writing there. In fact, some of my happiest memories are staying in this giant Victorian house that wasn't used for 9 months of the year by somebody I knew owned it, and I would kind of house sit there, and in the mornings I would work on whatever I was working on, and then in the afternoons I'd go out shingling. And it was just kind of the perfect blend, I thought, for writing.
Well, what do you think has helped your writing the most?
What helps me the most?
Yeah.
Well, I think I think it's just really the kickstart that happened in the Peace Corps with just doing so much writing. With the letters and the journals and writing stories there, that plus you have to have some kind of passion for it too. I mean, somewhere that develops some sort of passion for it. In fact, in the 70s, when I kind of first started, I wasn't really aware of that many Seattle and Northwest writers. I mean, like Tom Robbins was kind of the biggest thing around then, and he was from Virginia, and Raymond Carver was from Yakima, and I've kind of learned of more since then. But I don't know. At the time, you'd read Faulkner. He was from the South, and Hemingway's from the Midwest, and there's all these people from the East. So I've just, I was so entrenched in the Northwest that kind of pushed me to try to write about this area.
You wanted to be the Hemingway of the Northwest.
Well, I did go to Africa, so.
There you go. Now tell us, are you working on a new book, or do you have anything else that you're working on?
So let's see. As far as I got involved with some people, in fact, back east, who were really into self-publishing. I mean, you reach a point where you send these things out. Like I sent the Glenn novel out, sent everything out, and then eventually you reach a point where you go, well, I want to put this into a book and, sell it out of my trunk or something like that. So there's these three, and then I have finished 2 other novels. In fact, one of them ended up being 98,000 words, which is pretty big for a novel. And a second one that I just am finishing now. And then there's a third that is a collection of more stories that's more of like traveling.
So you've got a couple of novels now. Are you going to self-publish those? Are those coming out, or what's your
I've been
plans
trying
with those?
to shop the novels around, and you do it for a while and then I stop, and so at some point I will probably the story collection I will definitely put as a self-published thing, because that would be real tough to have somebody pick up. But
Right.
the other two, I'll see what happens as far as if anybody wants to publish them.
Got it. Now, I know that you've joined Author Event Network just recently, but you have done a lot of book sales, particularly in the East Coast. Tell us about what you find most invigorating or rewarding about actually meeting with readers in those signing events.
All right, well, that's a good question. So back on Cape Cod, there are some independent bookstores. In fact, there's one in particular called Yellow Umbrella Books in this little kind of a fishing village of Chatham, and they're real good at letting you set up a table out front. Any local author can set up a table, and so I will do that a few times a year, and it's amazing. In fact, when I first started doing it with this Jimi Hendrix book, I had a boombox, and I would be blasting Purple Haze on this boombox out in front of this bookstore, which was packed with people on their way to the beach. And this was fun. You'd see people, all of a sudden they'd turn like that, and they'd kind of start dancing, and then they'd come over and they'd pick up the book, and none of them would know that Jimi Hendrix was from Seattle. So, or in particular where Mount Rainier was or something. So that was kind of the most fun experience of doing that there. And then there were crafts fairs here and there where some other authors I know there we'd get a table together and sell at the crafts fair.
So you've already had the experience of what it's like to sell it in a big fair, which is what AEN does. So when you're engaging with readers and you're talking about your books, how do you basically pitch your books?
Well, this is sitting in front of a bookstore, so you're kind of they're usually kind of coming to go into the bookstore to look at something else. So you might, if they come over and look, I would usually ask them. I would ask them, "Have you ever been to Africa?" And it was amazing how many people go, "Yeah, I have." And then they would. I often would have a map of Africa, and then we'd go over what countries they'd been to and where I had been, and things like that. So you can engage them like that. With the Hendrix book, that was always easy to get people to stop and go, is that true? And I would go, yeah, and so.
What was Jimmy like as a boy?
Sort of, yeah. The counselor, yeah, he had some interesting things to say.
Well, and I know that I've seen some video of him in the Army before he became famous, and that's always an interesting dichotomy to see someone like that basically in their Army fatigues playing guitar and then learning how they kind of transformed after that. And so we all go through transitions. Tell us about some of the transitions that you've made as an author that brings you to where you're at today.
The transitions in...
As an author and as a person that has brought you through all your writing styles.
To my writing style?
Yeah, well, what have been the major influences in your life?
Well, I think, I was thinking about the first authors I read. I remember reading Vonnegut in college, and Cat's Cradle and Breakfast of Champions, and these things that were not really considered mainstream literary fiction. And that, I remember kind of like going through a phase of that, just real off the wall sort of stuff, and then kind of just it developing more to where you had more to say, and your ideas just got deeper or something, and moving on to more, just this fictional writing of, you'd come up with an idea for a story and just kind of go at it.
Well, if you were to describe one thing that you would want your readers to walk away from your books, what would that be?
Well, it's different. With these stories of the Pacific Northwest, they take place mostly in the 60s and 70s. And it's a time before Seattle, this is before Starbucks, before Microsoft, Amazon, all that stuff. Basically, when I was out in Massachusetts in the mid-late 80s even, I'd go, yeah, I'm from Seattle, and people would go, oh yeah, that's that town up there in the corner, right? And I go, yeah, and then so these stories are kind of like Seattle before it became well known, and there are stories in there like about, here's a key one, the Bubbleator. Now, what is the Bubbleator? You're probably
I'm trying to, that's exactly what I'm thinking.
So
I've heard of the Bubble Boy.
With the Seattle World's Fair, 1962 Seattle World's Fair, there's the Space Needle, there is the monorail, and then the third most basic emblem was the Bubbleator of the 21st century. So I have a literary story about the Bubbleator, and that's not easy to do. But there's also everything from, like, there's a story on the Huskies, the Husky football team. So this was before the Mariners, before there were any real sports teams in here. The Sonics had started in the 60s, but this is kind of the early 60s when I was a kid going with my father to those games, and it was the only event in the entire city. I mean, it was the biggest event, was these fall football games at Husky Stadium. So there's a long story about the Huskies.
Got it. Well, Rick, if you wanted to tell your readers where they can go to find more about your books and how to find your books, where would that be?
All right, well, my website is rickfordicebooks.com, and at Ballast Books in Bremerton, there will be some copies of the Hendricks book and the African book, and I guess at some of the fairs that we'll be doing.
Excellent, excellent. And we'll be broadcasting a special announcement about our AEN events in another episode. Well, Rick, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. We're with Author Event Network, and you're at Meet the Author. And I want to give a special call out and thanks to the Kitsap, Bremerton Kitsap Public Access Television crew. They do an amazing job, and we appreciate all their help. And to Peter Stockwell, who helps do our editing, and to all of the members of the Author Event Network. Thank you. Keep reading, and we'll see you soon.